everyone, I'm Jake Fife from Fife Paranormal, and I'm here in Stanton, Virginia in front of the infamous DeJarnette Sanitarium. Now, the history of DeJarnette is very long, very complicated, but it's also very unknown. There's not a lot of historical documents that exist from this building, and the little bit doesn't paint a very clear picture. So what you have here is, in the absence of verifiable fact, you have local legend that is run wild. I'm here today just taking some pictures, taking some B-roll, but I want to take a look at DeJarnette, Dr. Joseph DeJarnette himself, to see if there's anything in his life story that might have been missed before, but more importantly, could possibly explain why this location has the reputation that it has. Hello everyone, I'm Jake from Fife Paranormal.
Really?
Yes, really. It's been a while since I've had him in front of the camera. I finally let him.
You know, it's nice to meet you again. You know?
Well, for those who might not know you or haven't seen you in a while, what's your name and occupation?
So I'm Chris.
He's my handler.
Handler. Also known as Dad, Father, 8-1 enforcer, confidant.
And if you ask him, the wise one.
The wisest.
Real quick, introduction aside, where are we at?
We are in Warm Springs Cemetery.
Warm Springs, Virginia, a place full of history, full of twisty, windy roads that have a bunch of really cool stories to them. I came here seeing some pictures of the cemetery. I was like, that feels creepy.
I'm sorry, it's just you're very expressive with your hands, and I have one hand in my pocket, and I miss doing this because this used to be a lot of the banter back and forth. But Jacob's right, and I'm derailing him on purpose because I think it's fun. Interesting little town. It's really nice. Well, you know, the little bit we've driven through so far. Yeah. Cemetery's nice. I mean,
yeah. It's huge.
It's big. It's very big. Very well kept. You know, and all that. It's just a very peaceful place.
We did a little bit ago a spare box session, and we didn't really get anything. And kind of like you were saying, I didn't really feel too much. I know our main thing here was looking for the grave of Dr. Joseph DeJarnette, which it's really interesting. If you look all over the internet, you really can't find pictures of his grave. You can't find information. There's one picture I found on the entire internet.
And how much help was it finding this grave?
None.
Zero.
None. Because I looked at
picture of up close.
Oh, it is. Yeah, you kind of get the idea. It's just, you know, there's all of this you see. There's behind the camera a huge swath, and then it just keeps going back. But what's really interesting is as we were walking around the cemetery, getting our steps in for the day, week, month, year, there were Civil War graves. I found a plaque that said nearby there's unmarked Confederate soldiers buried here. A lot of them from 1861.
Well, you know, I found a bunch of marks.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, hey, all the way back to what, 1800s?
Yeah, well, this cemetery, Warm Springs Cemetery, was founded in 1800 exactly. So I'm sure there's Revolutionary War soldiers buried here. I'm sure there's frontiersmen buried here. It's kind of a mix of everyone, everything, but you also have a lot of new graves.
Yeah, and one thing that surprised me about the cemetery that you don't see in a lot of other cemeteries we've been in is I found a grave from 1905, and right beside of it was a grave from 2021.
Yeah.
You know, and it was just, there's really no older section, newer section. It's all kind of mixed, which tells you that that's a lot of family plots.
Right.
You know, I noticed that's a lot of family plots that are still being used.
So right behind me is the DeJarnette Sanitarium. Now, DeJarnette was built in 1932. It was named after Dr. Joseph DeJarnette, who was the director at Western State Hospital just over the hill here in Stanton, Virginia. Now, DeJarnette was very well known because he had a great track record of rehabilitations. Now, back then the standards for how and why someone could be committed were very different than they are today, and it was key, especially at a place like Western State, which had been around since the 1830s, they had to have the best doctors, they had to have the best numbers and the best care, because they needed people to be referred there, people to constantly be checking in. So when Dr. DeJarnette came there in the late 1800s, he quickly established himself as one of the top care physicians, especially for mental health, in the region. So he got a reputation that if you went to him, or you had a family member who was suffering from mental health issues, mental disabilities, DeJarnette was your guy to get them either the best care or to get the best rehabilitation. So throughout the course of time, as he's achieving these accolades, he's also getting to know the local area. He's involved a little bit in politics, not a whole lot, but the DeJarnette family is very well known and respected in this area. So you get to about 1905, 1906, he ends up marrying a nurse over at Western State. And from my research, this is when things kind of change in his story. You don't see as much of the aromatherapy presentation as he did, or the more constant checking in. You start to get some ideas of eugenics and sterilization creep into his life. Now, it's possible that he was already going in that direction, but from my research, the picture that it paints is that, once he married his wife and got to know her family, was around them just a little bit more, he started changing to a bit more eugenics.
DeJarnette, the man, is probably more in Jacob's wheelhouse. I don't know a whole lot more about him than what kind of Jacob's told me, some of the stories through the years that he's researched him, and all that. But I will say that, when you go by there, there's definitely some strange energy, which kind of surprised me with his many stories, and that's a very interesting point. What is myth, what is legend, and what is truth? With DeJarnette, a lot of it is clouded in mystery, not only the man, but also the building. So, we got a lot of secondhand stories. But, we come here looking for his grave, and I feel nothing here as far as like malevolence or any darkness. Or that's not to say you come here tomorrow and be like, oh my God, get me out of here. Anybody watching this knows how the haunted world works, or the world of the paranormal. But DeJarnette's an interesting figure, number one, for the historical references, number two, for the stories built up around him. And the stories built up around him are the more interesting, but the harder to prove. So I think Jake's done a really good job digging into a lot of the stories that aren't as known, and he's told me some interesting things, which I'm sure he'll share in this video.
In 1932, the building behind me, the DeJarnette Sanitarium in Stanton, Virginia, was built, named after Dr. Joseph DeJarnette, who was the director and longtime physician over at Western State Hospital, which is just over the hill here. DeJarnette had a reputation for being one of the best mental health doctors in the region. Since he had started at Western State Hospital in the late 1800s, he had a remarkable record of people being brought to him and not only being rehabilitated or quote-unquote healed, but quickly. So as he starts racking up these accolades, he starts making friends with people in the state, people in the government, people at universities, other mental health facilities throughout the state. And it gets to the point to where if you have a patient who you either can't handle yourself, needs to go to another facility, or all hope is seemingly lost, you brought him to Western State to Dr. Joseph DeJarnette. DeJarnette was given this facility by the state of Virginia for his help in testifying in a key case about mental health rights and abuses. Now, the building behind me, if you can see it, on the right is the original DeJarnette building built in 1932. The one on the left is the Peary building that was built in 1933. Now, there are not a lot of records about this place, and one of the reasons they say is federal law was a little different when it came to record keeping. If you had a private facility in 1932, you were not required to not only keep meticulous records, but also publish and share those records. So because of that, a lot of the things that happened at DeJarnette, a lot of the people there, a lot of the work that was done there is gone to history. Now, in the absence of history, legend takes shape. The legends of this place, they're far too numerous to talk about in one single video, because you have stories of abuse. You have stories of people going there for nefarious reasons. You have stories of people literally being rounded up from local communities, from regional communities, and being shipped here in vans and on train cars that are boxed up like boxcars, like they herd cattle. It's crazy, and you can't prove really any of it because of the lack of documentation. So, talking about DeJarnette and the whole story, the man, the sanitarium, Western State, there's a lack of historical record. You know, we can't go to a courthouse and find all the documents. So a lot of it has kind of fallen into local legend, people sharing their experiences. So when you look at the story of DeJarnette Sanitarium, in a lot of ways it seems like myth and legend gone wild.
I mean, how many oddball stories? I haven't dug nowhere near as deep as you, and I know of at least 3 or 4 pretty oddball, out there kind of stories connected to this place and these people.
Yeah.
You know, you've talked way more people than I have, and it's just sometimes certain legends develop a life of their own, and I don't know what to do with their best.
Yeah.
I know you feel a certain way about it, but I'm going to be honest, I don't know how much of it's true and how much of it is a great story to tell on a Saturday night during a thunderstorm. I don't know.
I mean, that's the thing about tall tales. Over time, they just grow taller.
Well, and there's always a kernel of truth. Do not get me wrong.
Yeah.
I'm convinced that there was some chicanery. Is that a word I can use?
That's a word we can use.
You know, chicanery that went on there. You know, and you know, Jacob touched on the fact that it's almost impossible to do any serious research on it because number one, they didn't keep great records back then, and number two, a lot of the records that were kept, they are lost to time. You know, for one reason or another, all depends who you talk to as to why that reason is. But they're gone. So you know, and you've managed to actually meet a couple of people that actually worked there when it was still
worked in patience.
Yeah. So you know, that was some really interesting stories.
Yeah.
First-hand accounts that makes you go, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, there's something to that.
And a lot of them seem to validate some of the even tall tales of DeJarnette.
I know I've only been near the building a few times. You know, closer than what is the gas station parking lot.
Yeah.
You know, but only like up to the building like a couple of times, and it's got an aura to it.
Yeah.
It's got an aura to it.
So one of the things also about DeJarnette is looking back even to the 50s. You know, it was opened in the 30s. You're talking 20 or so years after it was built and established, there were already ghost stories that it was haunted.
Oh, yeah.
So in your experience, your knowledge, your expertise, whatever you want to call it, a place that's already haunted, 20 years after being established, you're looking almost 100 years later. How does that impact those hauntings? Not only being haunted there, but just continuing to be susceptible to that energy, those, tragedies, what people allege.
There's different schools of thought there. I mean, if you're asking for my personal opinion, I think you can compound energy. I think you can feed it and add to.
Yeah.
And, then you kind of got to branch off of there, like ways of thinking. I've been in different places that it's like, this is cursed. This is cursed ground. There's something wrong here, And DeJarnette might be one of those places because, I've never got a good feeling being close to that building.
So you hear these stories, you do the research on the people. DeJarnette is one of those characters that if you can even prove half of the alleged things that happened here, this would be the most haunted place, if not in Virginia, in the country. Now, DeJarnette became the director of Western State Hospital around 1904, 1906. He also got married around that same time, and he seemed to kind of ramp up some more radical thinking mainly taking the form of the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement back then was essentially, if these people cannot be healed, if they have a disease we don't want out into the public or to procreate, we're going to sterilize them, typically against their will. So the theory back then, especially DeJarnette wrote poetry about these ideas. He wrote poetry and papers and articles saying how great of an idea this was, and that we were falling behind, and that America needed to be the world leader in eugenics. He loved the process. He loved the idea that if there is a bad strain in the bloodline out there in society, we need to get rid of it. That was his thinking at the time. That was the thinking of a lot of people in a lot of countries at the time. DeJarnette is a story that ever since we moved out there is just absolutely fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's no clear answer, there's no explanations, there's so many dead ends, yet hopeful, rabbit holes to go down.
How many years have you been trying to get us in that building?
Many years.
So if anybody knows anyone that can legally get us in there,
that would be cool. So I think a lot of things could be interconnected.
I'm just here tagging along.
No, no, but I think that's kind of a research path and also a paranormal path I haven't really seen anyone take before.
Well, no, I mean, it's a well-known story, but it's not an out-there known story.
Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff you see is very cursory, and that's not to cut on anybody. No, there's some good stuff out there.
Yeah.
But the kind of deep dive that you've been telling me that he's doing, I've never seen.
Yeah. Yeah, because my first job was working with, local ghost tours, and it was at the DeJarnette Sanitarium on the grounds, and, heard the same stories. Even in the videos that we've done, we've told, the same stories. That's because pretty much when it comes to the historical record we do have, it's very minimal, and so a lot of the stories are going to be the same. So that's why I really want to take this different approach to see if during the course of this research, if we can uncover something new, something that might be able to help the puzzle historically and paranormally.
Who knows what you're going to find? They go looking.
Yeah. We're going to fast forward just a little bit to the early 1940s. Now, in the early 1940s, DeJarnette is actually not spending a whole lot of time here from the records that I've seen. He spends most of his time over at Western State, but he does perform certain operations here. Some of the operations include lobotomies, which most of those ended up being done at Western State. Some were done here. He does a lot of bookkeeping here. He does a lot of staff training here at DeJarnette, and DeJarnette becomes known for the worst of the worst. Not only the mentally ill, but also criminals are sent here. If prisons were overcrowded or were having an issue controlling some of their detainees, they sent them here. Now, that's very interesting because you have a mental health facility that sees not only mental health patients, but also some general care, and then people just straight up being abandoned by their families and loved ones. Why are you mixing prisoners into that? Now, one of the things also is where he had a deal set up with the state where he received a lot of grant money. It was also very expensive to send your loved one or someone here. So not only do you have money coming from people being admitted here at a very high price, you also have grant money coming into the state. So it was very lucrative for DeJarnette and the DeJarnette staff to not only get as many people into these buildings as possible, but also get them out as soon as possible so you can bring more in. Hence is why they built 3 floors and they built a second building that was almost completely full of patient rooms. They wanted to make money while being able to do the kind of work and experimentation that they wanted to do. Now, going into World War II history just a little bit, in the 1930s, a lot of Nazi generals, doctors, and scientists took a trip from Nazi Germany to America. The main goal was to study what the Americans were doing. What was the American military history? What is American military strategy? What is their medical team doing? What is their transportation team doing with roadways, with communication, with city planning, logistics, supplying different areas? How are they handling their military? Or in this case, how are they handling the mentally ill? Or how are they treating people on mass scales? So Virginia was a very popular place for the Nazi leaders and Nazi officials. Many of the generals, including General Erwin Rommel, studied Jackson's Valley Campaign of 1862. That would have taken them all over the Shenandoah Valley, all the way from Winchester to Stanton to McDowell, down to Lexington and VMI. Now, we don't know exactly where they stopped. They were mentioned in a few newspapers, so that's how we know they were in certain areas and that they were checking out these places. One of the places that the doctors and the physicians from Nazi Germany were said to have stopped for more than a day was DeJarnette, right here. Now, one of the reasons that they would have had to do that is because DeJarnette set up a system of being able to do mass sterilizations. One of the ways that he did it, and once again, this is local legend, this is hearsay. I heard these stories from people who knew people who worked here, people who were patients here, stories that were passed down or have been written about, but no sources, no credible sources have been verified. So DeJarnette had an issue where it was taking too long to sterilize people, and he wanted it done quickly and efficiently so they could treat more people per day. So the story goes, is in the basement level of that building, the DeJarnette building, he built a big chamber, a big room that could be sealed from the outside. And supposedly, they would pump in gases, and they would mass sterilize people. And they would mass put people under anesthesia or under some form of drugs. Now, a lot of these people, according to legend, died. They were overdosed because you can't control necessarily how much, or, every single person is going to be susceptible to different doses. Their bodies are going to react a little differently. So you have all of these stories about DeJarnette. You have all of these things that are stories passed down from generation, from patients, from people who work there, people who visited there, but you can't verify it. And that's where the paranormal comes into play. There are so many ghost stories. This place even had a history of being haunted back in the 1960s. I talked to a woman who was a patient here in the mid to late 60s, and she told me that some of the older patients, we're talking, older teens, probably young adult, used to scare the younger patients, the kids, with ghost stories. And that supposedly they would see weird things running the halls at night. They would hear moaning and screaming. She even told me there was a story that someone would see something come out of the walls, growl and hiss, and then would go back into the walls, just disappear, which, if you're into the paranormal, that sounds very demonic. So, DeJarnette, so many stories about it. It is an odd place to, spend a lot of time, even just standing near. You constantly feel watched. If you've been looking at me, kind of looking around, you just feel like you're watched. And not only like you're watched, but like they're closing in on you. And it's a very odd feeling. For someone like me who, is just trying to film a stand-up video right here, it's very disorienting. Now, going back a little bit into the history, in the 1940s, once the horrors of the Holocaust became known to the rest of the world, the eugenics movement in America quickly lost steam, lost momentum. Most people, most facilities stopped it entirely, detested it, except for one guy in Virginia. DeJarnette still believed it was the best way to preserve the future of humanity. That is not hyperbole, that is what he thought. So while the rest of the world is going against eugenics, is stopping their programs, going against the Germans, losing all this money and equipment they're just throwing out, DeJarnette is the only one saying, no, we need to do more of that. And DeJarnette is ultimately voted out of his own board of directors. He's still a figurehead, but it's more of a title than him actually being able to do anything. And he has a very famous or infamous quote from 1944-45, I believe, and that was talking about eugenics. He said, Germany, which is Nazi Germany, they're beating us at our own game. We were once at the forefront of these medical advances, of the eugenics movement, doing all of this work for the betterment of mankind, and we've let ourselves fall. And he urged not only state officials, but federal officials to ramp up the program. Of course, at this time, like I said, eugenics was detested because of the Holocaust and what was going on in Nazi Germany. So DeJarnette very quickly fell out of favor. He would still spend time here. He would still spend some time at Western States. But after the death of his wife, it just really wasn't the same for him. He kind of retreats from the public eye. He resigns his post. He's still involved a little bit in some community affairs. He's still consulted on a few things. But past 1947, he really just fades into obscurity. Now, past then, the horrors don't stop at DeJarnette Sanitarium. There are stories going all the way up to when it was closed in the late 90s, early 2000s of abuse. There was supposedly a nurse or a head of nursing staff, that started here in the early to mid 60s, and she was known to be absolutely ruthless. Someone who was a patient here told me that it was almost run like a dictatorship, very much like a military school. All the patients, which mind you, mainly in this wing were children, young children, teenager, young adult, were absolutely terrified to speak, to do anything. They basically tried to stay in place and be quiet and mute the whole time because they were scared of this woman and the punishments that she would give out. Now, in terms of what those punishments were exactly, don't 100% know, but, you can look at stories, you can look at all these things, you can throw this stuff out there, but I really don't want to get into all of it simply because it can be proven. And there's a chance that some of this is true, some of it may not be true. That's the thing about local legend. In the absence of history, local legend runs wild. And if unchecked with actual history and documentation, it can outgrow the actual history, and it can, in some cases, do damage. So that's why, for me, it is extremely important to try and get to the bottom of the story of places like this. Because history deserves to be told, history deserves to be remembered, because we need to learn from it. We need to understand it. And at a place like DeJarnette, you have to think, there are many people that died here, and we don't know their names. We don't know why they were there, how they died, who they were, what their story was, what their families thought, what happened to them. It's stories like that that deserve to be told. And if you follow classic paranormal literature or theory, that is the classic recipe for a restless spirit. And that might be one of the reasons DeJarnette has the claim to be as haunted as it is. So that's a little bit of the history of DeJarnette Sanitarium. That's not all that. I could easily talk for an hour about the history of this place. We didn't even touch on when it was a private school in the 1970s and kids died under mysterious circumstances, or, the fact that when there was a golf course here, people would find hands and body parts when they would be, hitting out of the sand trap. It's just wild and crazy things like this. And, if I had just read all of this on the internet, some random person post it, that would be one thing. But to talk to literally dozens of people like I have, who were patients, who were physicians, worked here, staff, were here when they were boarding it up, people who dropped off packages here, deliveries here, all tell me similar horrific stories. It's like I've always heard as a kid, where there's smoke, there's fire. And part of the job of a good historian, researcher, and paranormal investigator is getting to the bottom of that story. And in the absence of records, you go to eyewitnesses, you go to the paranormal.